markets where those kind of risks are perceived as well. So yeah, it's a balance, I suppose.
Okay, I guess I worry a bit more about these those terrible images of people stripping down white goods or electronics in very unsafe environments.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's where the regulations and the systems are necessary.
Only regulation will really deal with that? Or?
Well, and all the infrastructure.
Yeah.
So basically, I mean, if you look in a lot of African countries, it's a huge problem, I mean, in terms of health of individual populations, but it's an economic driver, so you need the system.
An opportunity if the regulation is in place
and the infrastructure.
Good governance.
Yeah.
Christian, you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I would like to comment on this because from a previous life, I know for a big German corporate, I know the burden of localization, where it's about protection against copy and paste, about maintaining the quality standards, etc. For us at EnergyNest, actually, this whole concept of localization is a big opportunity. It's securing our competitiveness because in energy storage, business models are still developing, and it's all about low cost. So you want to be on the very low end of cost to compete to get energy storage products, right? And now there are obviously extremes if you look at without specifying names, but very south tip of South America, etc. Obviously, localization is a big issue. But in many of the developing countries, localization is our only chance as EnergyNest to really ensure those low prices. Limited transport, using manufacturers that are already in place, and also the workforce that's in place, especially for the EPC. Everything that relates to construction, where you have capabilities in pretty much every country, and we really require to use those in order to drive down our cost. Obviously, you have to ensure that there is no, that your IP is protected. In our case, we wouldn't outsource everything to the complete solution to a provider, but there's, the steel works that we outsourced, and there's work on the concrete side that we can outsource on the EPC, and obviously we would own the codes, for the sensors, etc., and for making the storage work. But I think by using existing networks that are there, and they are there, you cannot deny it, right? But they are there. We are easily achieving local content depending on where you are, between 65% and 90%. And for us, as an asset-light business, this is key, really, to survive and to be able to offer projects at competitive prices. And by coincidence, to comply to local content rules, yes.
Okay, so we're now starting to dive into some of the opportunities, and from the various contributions so far, I've got a little list here, and I want to see if we can sort of tick off a few and see whether we can probe whether those opportunities would be interested in, specifically through the lens of manufacturing. Okay, because there are opportunities that are on the infrastructure side. There are opportunities that can only work with regulators, but for manufacturers. So I've got here green energy procurement, recycling, storage, digitization, energy efficiency, and advanced manufacturing. So we've talked a little bit about advanced manufacturing. We've talked a bit about recycling as an opportunity that really needs a regulatory framework. Let's talk about some of the other ones. For manufacturers, particularly in the countries in which IFC operates, so developing world countries, green energy procurement, who wants to argue that is the big opportunity for a manufacturer? Felix, you're looking pensive there.
Well, just very attentively listen to you.
Oh, thank you. You're too kind. But if you can't argue for that, then I'm not sure who can. So green energy procurement for the manufacturers and their investors.
Yeah,
make the case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, it's a cost of energy, or levelized cost of energy for renewable energies has dropped substantially. All right. If you read Michael Bloomberg's report, you realize that, and we are at the forefront of it in many emerging markets, right? Using Mexico as an example here, and solar and wind auction price was $35 last year per megawatt hour, and this year's auction coming up in November, I'm sure it's going to come down again. So the opportunity especially for developing countries, I think it's because it didn't have this energy infrastructure as it had compared with the developed countries. And I think what's very interesting now is they can actually leapfrog and actually taking advantage, manufacturers in those countries taking advantage of between $15 to $30 per megawatt hour. This is cheaper than anything else. I mean, compare with, in UK, they have this Hinkley Point nuclear power plants. It's €110 per megawatt hour. And guaranteed by the British government, EDF and CGN, the French and Chinese companies working on that, and both companies actually having huge financial issues with this project. So I think the developing country, if they can do it intelligently and really harness their energy sources, because many developing countries have abundance of those renewable energy sources, and actually really taking advantage from $15 to $30 per megawatt hour. Right? Saudi Arabia 3 weeks ago was $18. Right? And Dubai, Abu Dhabi was in the 20s, and Turkey was in $29. And how do you actually really harness and really the energy cost and can go very cheap for those manufacturers in those developing countries, right? And in China, we are talking about building a big energy cluster, and which I mentioned earlier a couple of weeks ago, and together with Saudi Aramco and SPIC potentially, and providing $25 directly shipped to Beijing. And unfortunately, things about China is we're so industrialized. Just one province and 2 cities in Beijing is 400 gigawatts install base, right? And that's almost 3 times Germany. Just one province, 2 cities is almost three times Germany. How do we make it green and make it cheap? And this is something we really actually have to make.
Okay, so you heard it there. Big opportunity to purchase green electricity. Yes, Emily, you wanted to come in on that point, and then I'm going to ask you about storage.
Yeah, I think the only comment I wanted to make on that, given we're at an IFC conference, is you can make PPAs work where and when you've got investors and where you've got returns that attract investors and banks to do the deal, right? So if you talk about doing PPAs in developing countries, I think I'll articulate now that there's a need for those kind of investors. Maybe IFC is one to really back those PPAs, because otherwise you can talk about PPAs all you want in Africa. If your utility is near to bankrupt or creditworthiness is at doubt, you need someone to step in to have the courage to back those PPAs.
Okay, but how does that work for... but if we're talking about a manufacturer purchasing for their own, then the manufacturer is the off-taker, not the utility. Does that get around that problem?
Not so much, because I think, again, to make the overall deal, the PPA work, someone needs to fund it, right? Someone needs to front the deal from a capital investment perspective. And utilities may do so if they can via their own balance sheet, but I think you see more and more the need for investors, as I said, as well as banks, to facilitate the deal. And I can only tell you from my experience, we have had issues with PPAs or executing PPAs in some of the developed countries because we had a lack of investors that urged and wanted to invest in the deal.
I mean, it's certainly something we look at a lot. For the PPA to be signed by the utility, if the utility is not bankable, if the utility is essentially bankrupt, living from one handout from the state to the next, then you can't sign the PPA, and that has held back renewable energy development in a lot of countries. If the manufacturer is bankable, if it's a company operating internationally, maybe with a debt rating, then immediately you've got a leg up, but you've still got the sovereign risk, clearly, of the country in question. And so I think that's probably why we're here talking about this at an IFC conference, as you point out. Felix, you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think that's a very good point. And just one example in Mexico, what we have done is there is a lot of small and medium-sized companies, which exactly as Emily said, it doesn't have good enough credit ratings. So what we have done is we aggregate all the small and medium-sized, they're together, from one of them, well, some of them is only 1 to 5 megawatts demand, but we aggregate that to 50 to 100 megawatts. Then NetFin, the Development Bank of Mexico, actually providing guarantee on top of that. So provide actually the good enough credit that the bankers and the financial investors is able to, to invest in that.
Very interesting. So that's the opportunity of creatively, in a sense, that's arbitrage between the fact that they don't have a credit rating and presumably that, how can I put this, they were paying a margin for that service, that aggregation service. Yeah. So interesting opportunity there. Let's talk about storage, though. what's the opportunity for manufacturers in storage right now in some of these countries? Is it to manufacture storage? I mean, in a sense, Christian, you would say, because your opportunity with your thermal storage is to actually work with manufacturers to make these things, presumably. But
Two words to this. So it's an interesting market, and I think it's a market that's opening up now. Because when we came to the first customer with our product, they basically said, we have no waste heat. Because there's, we have a waste heat recovery system, and they talk about pipes, etc. It's great. But if you go in really with an assessment and take energy balances in those plants, you find, okay, you've got an excess there, you've got a demand here, etc., and it aggregates, and then all of a sudden you have a nice little storage opportunity for a whole plant. And this is a market that's developing now, and I think it's about systems that are cost-effective and are basically scalable from very small demands to large demands to help those manufacturers.
But that's on the demand side. In a sense, for each of these opportunities, a manufacturer could either be using the technology or they could be manufacturing the technology.
Yes.
So you think the big opportunity for storage is as a user of your product, not as a manufacturer of your boxes on contract to you, or
at least a two-step process. So at first you talk about the usability because there's a lot of potential to be harvested.
But you wanted to manufacture locally. But
Yes.
are you going to manufacture, or are you going to find local partners?
Local partners.
So that's an opportunity as well.
Yes,
Okay.
of course.
So yeah, Amelie.
I think my point was going to be around real-life example. If you go to Africa or South America and talk to mine operators, right, one of their biggest costs in their P&Ls is for diesel, for fuel generation,
diesel,
right?
yes.
To just have the operations running. And where we come in is to think about, can you take away that burden and replace more expensive diesel fuel generation, which is, however, reliable and dispatchable.